To turn on his video. So yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are nearing the end of a very eventful 30th session of the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. Although the circumstances are a little different this year, we are very grateful that you have found the time to attend this event. Before we dive into the subject, I quickly want to address some administrative remarks. We are providing translation throughout the event in both English and French. You can choose the audio channel you prefer. That's the little globe item on the right corner. Our first speaker will give her presentation in French. To prevent echoes and other audio interference, we will keep everyone on mute. If you want to pose a question, please raise them via the chat, either through Zoom or through our Facebook live stream. The link to the Facebook live stream is in the chat. For the Q&A session at the end. The Q&A session will be moderated by my colleague, Ms. Laurence Platmer. And I also want to quickly thank the Civil Society Unit and the Secretariat of the UNODC. They have been very helpful in making this event a reality. And now on to the subject at hand. The trend of an ever-increasing world population leads to a juvenescence of societies around the globe. UNICEF has estimated that more than 1 million children are behind bars around the world. Many of these children become vulnerable to human rights abuse. The Dominican Order has been conducting a research project on juvenile justice. Currently, justice systems in Africa are still often lacking a restorative approach, despite recent changes to improve the administration of justice, including juvenile justice. Moreover, the incarceration of minors in difficult prison conditions without alternatives to custodial sentencing remains a challenge in many countries. Through this side event, we want to bring new ideas to the table for more sustainable, restorative, and positive approaches to juvenile justice systems in an ever-changing world. I now have the pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, Ms. Evelyne Gabala. Originally from the Ivory Coast, Evelyne Gabala graduated from the University of Quebec in Montreal in biotechnology and molecular biology. In addition, she has a master's degree in management from the University of Montreal. In 2018, she joined the Justice, Peace, and Environment Commission of the Dominican Convent in Abidjan, where she has been vice president since January 2021. Evelyne Gabala is also the coordinator of the first Dominicans for Justice and Peace project in the Ivory Coast. Ms. Gabala, the floor is yours. Evelyne, you're still on mute. But I think now we should be able to hear her.
Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Merci Tobias de me donner la parole. Je voudrais avant tout propos, au nom de la Commission Justice, Paix et Environnement du couvent Saint-Dominique d'Abidjan en Côte d'Ivoire, exprimer notre gratitude pour l'opportunité que vous nous donnez de partager quelques observations clés sur la justice juvénile dans le contexte de notre projet commun en Côte d'Ivoire à l'occasion de cette 30e session de la CCPCJ. Alors, ce projet de monitoring et de plaidoyer sur la justice juvénile a pour objectif la défense et la promotion des droits des mineurs infracteurs en contact avec la justice. Pour réaliser ce projet, nous avons décidé, par la visite des lieux d'accueil et de détention des mineurs, de marcher dans les pas d'un mineur infracteur depuis son interpellation jusqu'à sa réinsertion en famille ou dans la société. La porte d'entrée du mineur dans le système judiciaire est le commissariat de police, la gendarmerie, et la sous-direction de la lutte contre la traite des enfants et de la délinquance juvénile, ce dernier établissement que nous avons visité. Pour faciliter la compréhension de tous, nous allons appeler tous ces établissements le commissariat des enfants. Alors, le mineur qui arrive au commissariat des enfants, il est écouté par un agent qui diligente une enquête dans un délai de 24 heures. Ce délai peut être prolongé par le procureur et dans ce cas-là, l'enfant est placé dans un centre d'hébergement provisoire qui n'existe malheureusement pas. Alors, à la fin de sa garde à vue, l'enfant avec le rapport d'urgence des agents, l'enfant est soit relaxé et soit conduit au parquet, où il va comparaître devant le juge des enfants. Au parquet, les mineurs partagent les mêmes cellules que les adultes. Et ce sont les services de la protection judiciaire de l'enfant et de la jeunesse qui s'occupent donc du suivi du dossier du mineur auprès du juge, de la réalisation des enquêtes sociales nécessaires et assurent aussi une assistance alimentaire et psychosociale du mineur. Alors, le délai de garde à vue au niveau du parquet est également de 24 heures. Ce délai peut être prolongé sur autorisation du juge des enfants et dans ce cas, le mineur est placé toujours dans un centre d'hébergement provisoire qui, je le rappelle, n'existe pas. Sur la base donc du rapport des services de la protection judiciaire des enfants, le juge peut prendre la décision de relaxer cet enfant ou alors de le conduire, de le déférer dans un centre d'observation pour mineurs. Et dans ce centre, l'enfant séjournera pour une durée de 3 mois renouvelable une seule fois, c'est-à-dire 6 mois maximum. Et la prise en charge alimentaire, sanitaire et les activités éducatives et récréatives de cet enfant sont assurées par le centre d'observation des mineurs qui accueille l'enfant, observe son comportement, effectue toutes les enquêtes sociales nécessaires et évalue sa capacité à se réintégrer dans la société. Alors, le camp d'Abidjan que nous avons visité est situé dans l'enceinte de la maison d'arrêt et de correction d'Abidjan, qui est une prison pour adultes. Et cet établissement n'a pas d'atelier de formation équipé, d'espace récréatif équipé, ni de réfectoire, contrairement à ce qui est prévu par la législation. Alors, à l'issue de ce temps de détention de 6 mois maximum, au COM, un rapport d'observation est transmis au juge des enfants pour l'aider à prendre la décision de libérer ou de transférer ce mineur dans un centre de réinsertion des mineurs pour une durée ne pouvant excéder 3 ans. Et dans ce centre de réinsertion, l'enfant bénéficiera d'une formation socio-professionnelle, diplômante ou qualifiante. Le CRM d'Abou que nous avons visité vient d'être complètement rénové, mais malheureusement, tous les bâtiments neufs ne sont pas équipés et ce centre ne dispose pas de budget pour rémunérer les formateurs. Alors, en conclusion, on peut dire que la législation ivoirienne, pour la législation ivoirienne, le mineur infracteur qui rentre en contact avec le système judiciaire est privé de liberté pendant un maximum de 3 ans, 6 mois et 2 jours avant de pouvoir réintégrer la société. Pourtant, nous avons rencontré un mineur infracteur lors de notre visite au centre d'observation des mineurs d'Abidjan en mars 2021 qui séjourne depuis aujourd'hui 3 ans et 11 mois. Les principales conclusions de ce projet sur la justice juvénile en Côte d'Ivoire montrent que la Côte d'Ivoire est bien nantie en texte de loi et juridique en matière de justice juvénile conforme aux normes internationales. Et cette législation est même révisée. Cependant, leur mise en œuvre reste la problématique majeure car ils ne respectent pas les normes nationales édictées par la législation et encore moins les normes internationales. Les raisons sont d'une part parce que cette législation, héritée de celle de la France, n'est pas adaptée aux réalités de l'environnement du pays, et d'autre part à cause du manque de ressources humaines adaptées, du manque de ressources matérielles et financières. Cette situation compromet gravement les chances de restauration et de réinsertion du mineur infracteur qui entre en contact avec la justice. Alors, au regard de ces conclusions de notre expérience en Côte d'Ivoire, nous sommes convaincus de la nécessité de privilégier la solution alternative à la détention comme la déjudiciarisation, la probation, la médiation, les conseils et les travaux d'intérêt généraux pour la restauration et la réinsertion du mineur infracteur dans la société. Aussi, pour la restauration de la justice juvénile, quant à elle, à notre avis, passe par la priorité et le respect à accorder à l'intérêt supérieur du mineur et à son application systématique dans les procédures et les décisions judiciaires. Et enfin, l'allocation de ressources financières, matérielles et humaines nécessaires pour le fonctionnement effectif et durable des établissements et services socio-éducatifs de la protection judiciaire de l'enfant et de la jeunesse. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. We will move on to our next speaker, Richard Robinson. He has a very impressive biography. I will shorten it a little bit for time's sake. Richard currently serves as Senior Correctional Advisor in the U.S. Department of State's Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, a position he has held since the spring of 2019. Prior to his work at INL, Mr. Robinson began his career in human services over 27 years ago, providing care for mentally and developmentally disabled youth and adults while working with multiple state agencies. Mr. Robinson has since served within and retired from the Arizona Department of Juvenile Corrections after serving for 21 years in such roles as Youth Correction Officer, Training Specialist, Youth Program Officer, Quality Assurance Manager, Youth Program Manager, Training Officer, and much more. So he's definitely a subject matter expert. I'm grateful to have him here today, and I want to start his presentation with an introductory question. Richard, can you share with us the vision of the U.S. State Department on juvenile justice and justice reform in Africa, as well as some good practices moving forward? Richard, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Toby. I'm hoping everybody can hear and see me okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone here. Let me begin by, first of all, thanking you all so much for allowing me the honor and the privilege of being allowed to serve on this panel and to speak to such a esteemed group of change agents who wish to improve the opportunities for success of youth who may be at risk of falling into the deep end of the criminal justice system. As introduced, I'm Richard Robinson, and I did spend that time in the background that Toby had given me in juvenile justice. And whenever I have the opportunity to speak to a group of like-minded individuals, I try to do my best to promote something that's really near and dear to my heart, which is the implementation of restorative justice practices and how they can have such a tremendous effect on the success of any juvenile or adult offender for that matter. And please note, throughout my presentation, I will be referring to those who have committed criminal acts as offenders. I know there's other terms out there, but that's the one that I've used throughout my career. So that's what I will refer to. My particular focus and my particular talking points will be on a term that I've deemed or termed as restorative justice or restorative alternatives. As you may have figured out, it's just a word play between alternatives to incarceration, ATI, and restorative justice, RJ. While these concepts I discuss are not new to any of you all, in fact, many of them have been around since the development of the rule of law. The concept that I would like to introduce to you attempts to better clarify and conjoin these practices to effectively address antisocial thoughts and actions. In answering the question that Toby posed a moment ago regarding current efforts in the United States to address juveniles who are involved in the criminal justice system, I would look to work that is sponsored by the Department of Justice's Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, commonly known as OJJDP, as well as that of the Annie E. Casey Foundation based out of Baltimore, Maryland. However, for INL, on an international scale, the emerging trend is the realization that in order to proactively meet our mission to counter crime abroad, we must address the inception of criminalized cognition and behaviors in youth. It is daunting and it may not get the types of headlines that we're used to seeing, but the end game can be transformative. So we look for motivated persons like all of you who are attendants today and the panelists today to promote this trend. So in the time I have allotted, and believe me, I can talk for days on this subject, I wish to clarify that there are there's distinct differences between ATI and RJ. Many times the two are lumped together, but I propose to you that they are diverse in their focus and should be treated as such. I also seek to promote the best ways to conjoin these processes to increase positive efficacy for offender reintegration, not only for the offender, but for their victims as well. And lastly, I want to present to you an example of a tool that can be used to best promote the concept of restorative alternatives. To start, I wish to bring you back to the Nelson Mandela rules, which many of you throughout the sessions this week have referred to or have been referred to. And I know you're all quite familiar with this. One of the rules that jumped out to me when I was preparing these particular remarks is 4.1, where the focus is reintegrating the offender. It's highlighted there. In particular, I bring your attention to the phrase, the reintegration of such persons into society upon release so that they can lead a law-abiding and self-supporting life. Now, when you read this, I believe you most likely have the same question I did, which is where does the victims of crime and the communities that have been impacted by the crime fall in the process? And I hope to briefly address that in my comments here. So when we're talking about alternatives to incarceration, and to better illustrate that, I want to try to do some comparative and contrasting points between the two. Now, when you're talking about alternatives to incarceration, sanctions other than incarceration are typically offender focused and to divert them before incarceration. But of course, there are some forms of ATI that can be implemented post-incarceration, like work release programs and halfway houses. ATI models are assumed to be fairness forward in that the offender is suitable for community placement and that the placement is afforded in the least restrictive environments. The assumption is also that any efforts outside of physical incarceration will directly or indirectly support the offender moving themselves to present more pro-social behavior, and that they will be able to work to prevent further involvement in criminal behavior in the future. By not incarcerating the offender, it obviously alleviates the burden of national and regional resources and reduces national cost burdens, of course. We know that's a big advantage. And we all know that usage of ATIs is an excellent tool to reduce prison overcrowding and can assist in alleviating population crises like what we are currently addressing around the world due to the COVID pandemic. Usage of ATIs most likely require fundings for infrastructure, though, that are like supportive physical plans like reporting centers, technology like satellite tracking coverage, and equipment to utilize electronic monitoring systems, and of course, the funding needed to have the personnel to operate these infrastructures and technologies. Because yes, any good ATI must be monitored and enforced by governmental officials, like local law enforcement, parole, probation officers, to determine the compliance, to issue sanctions, or to encourage the offender to adhere to the conditions of release. Again, you may note that much of these are offender focused. But when you look at the application of restorative justice responses, we see that the tasks here can be incorporated before, during, and after incarceration. They are generally victim-centered by nature and require the inclusion of the victim throughout the process. And they seek to repair the mental, physical, and emotional damage caused by the criminal act, as well as provide the victims continued safety within their communities. As RJ process bolsters thoughtful community reintegration for the offender, it also allows the community to provide input into reintegration plans to make modifications as needed. So it isn't necessarily about massive funds needed to implement these types of plans either. This really only takes the cooperation amongst all the parties involved, the offender, the state, the victim, and the receiving community. The development of community action teams, or CATs, who work together to ensure that all aspects of a successful reintegration plan are properly coordinated is essential. And faith-based organizations like some of who may be on the line today, who are represented here, are integral in establishment of strong community action teams. Now, depending upon how creative all parties involved are, RJ options require minimal resources as the community themselves act as the plan developers. And they are compelled to support the successful completion of the RJ action with the offender because of their attachment to it. As with ATI, RJ actions do require monitoring and enforcement by governmental officials, but now you have the added layer of support by enlisting the aid of the victim and the community members to help ensure the success of that reintegration plan. Now, we've all seen the different types of examples that are out there in regards to alternatives to incarceration, such as work release programs, day and evening reporting centers, and electronic monitoring. And we all know those to be effective by and of themselves. But I challenge you to imagine the impact of these types of incarceration alternatives coupled with a restorative focus. For example, think of a work release program where the offender has to complete work on the behalf of the victim or the community, or as a condition of release, the individual offender will be required to complete and present a victim impact letter. Those are just a couple of different ideas, but the menu of options when you bring these two concepts together to affect meaningful change.
Sur l'impact sur la victime. Ce ne sont là que quelques idées. Voilà, il y a vraiment la liste pour trouver des actions réparatrices s'élargit. Donc, si je vous présente à ce nouveau paradigme, toute action
that advocate for the restoration of victims of crime and their communities while enforcing the successful reintegration of individuals deprived of liberty. Now, that's my definition. It makes sense to me, but I'm always willing to take some feedback on this if you have some thoughts. So in talking about the restorative action or restorative alternatives concept, one tool that developed that I believe effectively encompasses this concept is known as restorative action planning, or RAPS. What this particular type of action does is it uses an amalgam of cognitive behavioral approaches, empathetic skill building and learning exercises, and victim-centered activities and benchmarks to initiate a comprehensive restorative alternative to incarceration. A tool that can be utilized as 1, a form of diversion, 2, a prerequisite to release from prison, and 3, as a condition of community release that can be completed prior to full discharge from state supervision. So hopefully you can see how this can be very beneficial in the process. Now, the RAP plan is developed in 3 stages, with the understanding that depending upon the work presented, the offender may progress or regress until the plan is fully realized. As the plan is developed, it's presented in restorative action groups, RAGs. We love the acronyms around here, of varied membership. Now, the group can consist of program staff, victims advocates, peers, the victim themselves, and community members in these particular groups. And the groups utilize a combination of like talking circles, if you're familiar with that concept, mediation, active role playing, real life, real-time activities, extensive qualitative reviews of the plan, group feedback, and plan revisions throughout all levels of the process. And this cycle would continue through the entirety of the process, eventually leading to the offender actually enacting the RAP plan for the victim and the community. In the efforts to provide commitment to the victim and the community that the offender is resolute in their commitment to citizenship and no further victimization. Now this is just a snapshot into the process. It's still in what I consider to be beta mode. However, I would be more than happy to discuss this concept further with anyone who wishes to talk about it. And I'll provide you my contact information shortly here. So after that kind of run through of my take on restorative alternatives, I want to come back to that rule that I introduced earlier with the Nelson Mandela Rules 4.1. I still believe that the bulk of this is very important and needs to remain, but I've also added, in my belief, that should be added to this particular rule, a restorative alternative inclusive statement. So if I was to go back and to revise this, I would want it to read something like, the reintegration of such persons into society upon release so that they can lead law-abiding, self-supporting lives that positively support their communities and ensures no further victimization. And now, again, if you see that with that simple additional wording there, it does encompass that restorative alternative piece. And I see that this is a potential change to our language, which hopefully changes our overall paradigm as we all move forward together in improving our juvenile justice systems across the world. So in closing, please note my contact information is here, along with my other corrections teammates who are based in Washington, D.C. With our TAD advisory, technical advisory team. We split the world into different areas. I take Africa, Middle East. We have of course, the Western Hemisphere and so on. I believe you all be able to reference this material at the end of this session, but again, feel free to contact me at the email address listed here if there's any follow-up that I can do with you or to talk more about this. I stand ready to support you in any ways that I can. So finally, I want to thank you all again for allowing me the opportunity to speak, and my fellow panelists as well for your participation in today's session. It's truly my honor to address you all, and your attendance alone shows your openness to paradigm shifts like this. I also want to thank Madeline Murphy Hall and the rest of the U.S. delegation that have been really working hard throughout this Congress, and our great team back in Washington, D.C. for their great support and allowing me to continue to speak on a subject matter that I believe to be of great importance. And my hope is that my remarks here have provided you with some great insights on best practices in juvenile justice programming.
Vous a été utile. Et si vous voulez savoir davantage, voilà, pour vos missions dans vos propres pays.
You may have or today or in the future. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was very interesting. Our last speaker for today is Jeffrey Bauer. He is a program officer with the regional section for Africa and the Middle East in the UNODC Division of Operations. Before spearheading the development of UNODC's Strategic Vision for Africa 2030 in his current capacity, Jeffrey was based in Dakar, Senegal for 5 years, coordinating the UNODC Sahel program. Jeffrey began his career at the UNODC in 2010 with the Civil Society Unit, after being a special advisor to the Prime Minister of Quebec on commercial and political issues related to China and India. Jeffrey, what are the key objectives of the Vision for Africa 2030 developed by the UNODC, and can you share with us some new approaches to juvenile justice systems? Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for this introduction, and also to the two other speakers before me for really their insightful presentations. I've learned a lot, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to provide you a glimpse on how UNODC will really upscale its work in Africa in the next 10 years, and how the topic of juvenile justice we are discussing today fits into this framework of making criminal justice systems more effective and accountable. So please allow me to share my presentation with you, which I promise will be as short as possible. Great. So our strategic vision for Africa that we've developed in the past of 2020, and we were lucky in a way to have the COVID pandemic, so that we were able to have an extensive consultation process with various stakeholders in Africa. And for us, it was very important to anchor our strategic vision, what we will do in Africa in the next 10 years, on one side, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, and on the other side also the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, so as a guiding framework on how we will move forward on the continent. In the consultation process that we held with various stakeholders, and I look at Richard because we also consulted with INL very closely, we had the chance and the opportunity to consult with a lot of civil society organizations throughout Africa. And one of the questions that we asked civil society members, and these include faith-based organizations, community-based organizations, and other NGOs working on topics related to UNODC, what were the main challenges that Africans faced in their daily lives? We wanted to have to have a sense of what were these challenges. And from this graphic, you will see corruption was the #1 answer. But in the top 5 answers, youth vulnerabilities to crime, drugs, and violence. As we know, Africa's population is very young. Over 70% is under the age of 25. So the criminal justice system are more often than not faced with younger offenders or victims that they have to process. So this for us was very insightful to determine what would be our priorities for the next 10 years. Of course, as many of you know, UNODC has a very wide mandate, but we had to boil it down into the 5 investment areas that you see here, which are all equally important, and there is no order of importance. I would like just to bring your attention to the second investment area about securing the safety of people from organized crime, terrorism, and violence, and with the investment area 5 on making criminal justice systems more effective and accountable. So these 2 are really the ones that are relevant in the discussions that we have today. This is more what we will do working with African member states, institutions, NGOs, and also the private sector. There are different stakeholders that we need to engage to really make to meet our objectives in making Africa safer from drugs and crime and terrorism. The how is also equally as important. We need to have, first of all, stronger partnerships. We need to work closer with civil society organization, as I mentioned, and really looking at how women can play a role in achieving these objectives and using them as an agent of change. equally also in how we can empower children and youth in this to bring about transformative change. Prevention is key. For us, 1 ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as they say. We don't want to be seen as firemen and helping out member states when they face difficulties, but looking way before this and promoting approaches that prevent children to be in contact with the criminal justice system, for example. And last point on discrimination and stigma, I will come back to it. This is extremely important as we see how children in contact with the criminal justice system, when they go back to their families, to their communities, they can face a lot of stigma from them, and that will hinder the whole process, the comprehensive process that we want them to be back in a normal lives. So this is just a quick overview of our strategic vision and how UNODC intends to really upscale our assistance on the continent for the next 10 years. And hearing from Evelyn and from Richard, I have a lot of confidence that we can get there by working with various partners and learning from each other and to complement our actions. So this was my presentation, but I would also like to highlight the importance of prevention, as I said, of violence against children, drug abuse also, as one of the best investments that we can do for the continent. There is a need for appropriate responses to children in distress and potentially in conflict with the law, but which is not limited to repression and imprisonment. These can be supported by parenting skills. And I would just like to highlight one example of my time, as Tobias said, when I was in the Sahel region. One good example that we can learn from is from Burkina Faso, where judicial authorities have a number of alternative measures to imprisonment at their disposal, including education and social reintegration centers. They're called Sermicol, I believe, which allows judges to place children who have committed offenses and who require rehabilitation, a little like what Evelyn mentioned in Côte d'Ivoire. So these centers have the presence of psychologists, professional trainers, and social service workers who accompany children in their reintegration, providing for parental visits and socialization within the community to avoid this stigma that can happen. And this work from social workers in sensitizing community leaders is also very important before this reunification to prevent that stigmatization to the child. And here, civil society organizations play an important role in that process, but also to allow mothers, for example, that they can come and provide for the needs of their children, and having the children not forced to go to work once they are outside of the system, but allowing them to attend school. So in conclusion, please allow me to be fair to my fellow speaker, Evelyn, to make my conclusions in French, if that is acceptable. You can switch into the interpretation mode if you would like to hear it in English. Mais en conclusion, c'est extrêmement important pour l'ONUDC d'avoir cette perspective de la société civile sur comment nous pouvons travailler très étroitement avec les enfants qui sont en lien avec les systèmes de justice, mais comme mon collègue Richard a mentionné, aussi les victimes et les victimes potentielles. Et comment est-ce que, à la fin, comment est-ce que nous pouvons travailler ensemble, à la fois avec les organisations de la société civile, mais aussi les autres partenaires sur le terrain et aussi nos partenaires internationaux pour vraiment protéger ces enfants-là et apporter plus de sécurité dans les communautés, mais aussi de prévenir les problèmes de drogue, de terrorisme aussi et de criminalité. Donc, je vous remercie et n'hésitez pas à nous contacter. Si vous avez des questions, je suis ouvert aussi à les répondre. Merci.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. I'm happy our interests finally aligned enough to have you as a speaker in one of our side events. That made me very happy personally today. Before handing over to my colleague, I quickly wanted to thank today's speakers and their organizations. Thank you, Evelyn, Richard, and Jeffrey. You have been truly nothing short of fantastic to work with. Thank you very much for bringing this topic to the CCPCJ in such a captivating and informative way. I also want to thank the US Department of State and the UNODC. Ms. Laurence Blattner will now take over for the Q&A session. Not only is her French much better than mine, but she has also accompanied the team in the Ivory Coast as the project coordinator for the past 3 years. It is always a pleasure to work with her. Ms. Blattner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tobias. So I was expecting to speak in English, so just for interpretation purposes, I'll try to stick with English. So, thank you, everyone. It was insightful presentations. I think a lot has been said, and I'm sure participants could learn a lot from your 3 presentations. I see that we start having some comments on the chat, so I encourage everyone to post any questions or comments on the chat of the Zoom, as well as on the chat of Facebook. We only have a few questions left, so maybe just as a starter, a quick question for each of you. Evelyn, I'll start with you. What do you think about with the COVID-19 crisis? Has this affected the juvenile justice in Ivory Coast, or do you think the situation is rather the same with the COVID? And also, Richard, have you seen some openness towards restorative justice approaches throughout your career? And is it a long-lasting trend? And maybe for you, Jeffrey, if you had just one recommendations to address to governments in Africa, what would it be? So maybe I can start with you, Evelyn, if we can have short answers, and if we have time, we'll go for a second round of questions. Evelyn, you have the floor.
Merci, Laurence. Évidemment, je dirais que la crise de la Covid a eu un impact sur le système judiciaire, dans ce sens où les ONG nationales qui travaillent en étroite collaboration avec les établissements de la protection judiciaire n'ont pas pu effectuer leur travail comme d'habitude, c'est-à-dire apporter ce soutien alimentaire, sanitaire et autres qu'ils ont l'habitude de faire, parce que leur contribution est vraiment remarquable au niveau du système judiciaire de l'incarcération des mineurs. Donc, il y a eu vraiment effectivement un impact à ce niveau-là. C'est ce que je peux dire.
Merci Evelyne pour cette réponse concise. Je continuerai peut-être avec Richard, s'il vous plaît.
With restorative justice practices and alternatives to incarceration, as I presented in 2 separate types of concepts, there've both been extensive studies and work done around it. So it's the reception for those concepts are there, but I think what I'm trying to introduce here is that they can be much more effective when they work together. Instead of seeing a lot of work in one or the other, getting the establishment to understand that when you combine these two together, and I think that's new. And when it comes to receptiveness to that, I'm not sure yet, but I just see that as a tool moving forward in the future that if we were to step into that more, we'd be able to be much more effective when it comes to dealing with issues like victimization, as well as things in population crises, resource management. There's a lot of different functionalities to this, but I think the first step is understanding that they can't be used as separate entities. They should be worked in conjunction with one another to help support the successful reintegration, while at the same time supporting the victims. Because a lot of times we hear about all the efforts we put into the offenders and successful reintegration and providing them with the supports they need to be successful in aftercare or pre-incarceration. But I would like to hear more about how's that affecting the victims. So that's if there's one thing I want to stay on my soapbox about throughout the rest of my career, it's that we have to combine the two if we want to be much more effective.
Thank you, Richard. Just to inform you that we now start having some comments on the chat. 2 comments relate to your presentation. Sister Dusty says, I appreciated Richard's alternatives. I'd not heard of the third approach before. Also, comment from Constance from Ivory Coast, who is saying that the approach in the States could be very relevant to the Ivory Coast context. So thanks a lot for those inputs. Jeffrey, so if you had only one recommendation to governments, what would it be?
That's a hard question. Definitely, there is no silver bullet, but definitely in my experience also on the ground, my main recommendation would be for governments and institutions to really listen to their constituents, to listen to the victims, and to listen to the ones who are going through this process and to learn from it. On one side, on the other side, also to listen to the neighbors, to other governments and member states in their region or that developed innovative ways of dealing with those challenges. There's a lot to learn through international cooperation, and UNODC is also helping in that effort to bring about best practices, South-South cooperation, and promoting this kind of collaboration within Africa or also from other places in the world. I know of good examples of Latin America, that have been replicated in Africa. So that would be my advice to the governments.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. I think this leads us to already the end of the session. I wish we could have some more time for questions and comments, because I see now people are starting to comment on the chat. Anyway, I think if people have any questions to follow up with, I'm sure we can take them and direct them to one of the 3 panelists, and we can clearly follow up with a dialogue on this very interesting issue. So maybe, Tobias, I'll give you back the floor.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists again, and also the participants that watched us through Zoom. I hope we can resume next year in more normal circumstances, and I can all look you in the face in the room, and we can all sit together and discuss more interesting issues again in person. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the CCPCJ so far, and I don't want to keep you from heading to the next side events, which will start in a moment. So thank you very much again, and yeah, goodbye, I guess, at this point.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye.
is everyone still there? We have 18 participants. I think we have to, we should, yes,
Yeah.
please.
Okay. Well, I don't know.
Because
No, I think you have to end it because participants are still there.